Hi, everyone. We're so glad you're joining us today for this exciting discussion between Nani Jansen Reventlow and Stephanie Brobbey, and to celebrate the launch of Nani's incredible book, Radical Justice, Building the World We Need, which feels really essential right now. So we're really grateful to you all for coming together with us today as we dive into our themes of how we make change in the world and how each of us can be the revolution. Before we get into that, I'm just going to briefly introduce Good Ancestor Movement and our work, and also give a bit of background on Nani and Stephanie. We are a social purpose organisation dedicated to supporting people and organisations with access to wealth in values-aligned wealth stewardship and radical redistribution. We're disrupting the mainstream private wealth industry by challenging traditional ideas about the economy, excessive wealth growth, tax minimisation, and the sharing of resources and power. There are various strands to our work, including supporting wealth holders to unlock their resources through programs, consultancy, and community building. We also work with financial advisors to support shifts in the private wealth industry, and we think about new ways to mobilise resources and fund the work of systems change. And our work is grounded in the question of what it means to become a good ancestor, which hopefully we'll be able to explore a little bit today in this conversation. I'm working on the programming side of Good Ancestor Movement, and we're offering a range of one-off events over the next year to give people a taste of our work and offer different learning opportunities. I'll share a bit more about that later on, but we always love to connect with new people, so please don't hesitate to get in touch and find out more about us. So before I hand over to Nani and Stephanie, I'll give a bit of background on both of these incredible speakers that we have today. Nani Jansen Reventlow is an international human rights lawyer specialized in strategic litigation at the intersection of human rights, social justice, and technology. She's the founder of Systemic Justice, which advocates for marginalized communities across Europe through strategic litigation. Previously, she founded the Digital Freedom Fund and has an extensive background in promoting human rights in the digital context and in defending journalists and activists in some of the most repressive environments in the world. Politico named her one of society's great visionary tech leaders in 2021 for her work on digital human rights. She's been honoured with awards from Harvard, Oxford, and Columbia University, among others. Nani is the author of Radical Justice, as we know, which we'll be discussing today, a wonderful collection of 9 essays on how we build a better world. Very exciting to have you with us, Nani. Stephanie Brobbey is the founder and CEO of Good Ancestor Movement. She is a financial activist and practitioner seeking to mobilise private capital in service of a just economy. She practiced as a private wealth lawyer in the City of London for a decade, during which she gained an outstanding reputation in the private wealth industry and was named one of ePrivate Client's top 35 under 35 in 2020 and 2018. Following a decade in private practice, in September 2021, Stephanie launched the Good Ancestor Movement. Stephanie's mission is to leverage the power of private capital around the world to help accelerate the just transition to a regenerative economy. Alongside her team at the Good Ancestor Movement, Stephanie supports wealth holders primarily based in the UK, Europe, and North America to transform their practices around wealth, tax, and redistribution. In recognition of her work, Stephanie was elected as an Ashoka Fellow in 2023 and as a Fellow of the Just Economy Institute's 2023 to 24 cohort. Stephanie was named as one of the 100 most influential people in the world of private wealth in the inaugural Spears Powers list in 2023 and in the Spears Powers list 2025. So, very excited to have both of you with us today and to get into this incredible conversation. And I think we're going to begin by handing over to Nani to give a little reading from Radical Justice before going into conversation with Stephanie. So Nani, over to you.
Thank you so much. We can build change as we go along. Since life is actually not an exam, we don't have to score a perfect 10 out of 10 get everyone to agree with us on all points, and have precisely mapped out steps on how to get there. In philosopher Olufemi Taiwo's words, we don't have to agree on every aspect of the new world we're building to agree on ways to improve the justice of our current arrangements. We can move forward, making our vision for a better world a reality without having a perfect plan or having every single person on our side. We'd be much better off using this energy in different ways. What all change does start with is envisioning what you are going to create. And if there is anything that has a chance of persuading others to join your cause, it's exactly that image of hope and being able to see that things don't have to remain the way they are. You've got to sell people on a beautiful tomorrow. Anand Kardardas quotes political messaging expert Anat Shenker-Osorio in The Persuaders. So instead of continuing to meet the keepers of the status quo on their turf, engaging with their conversations, we need to start our own. Share the vision of what a world underpinned by equity, social, racial, and economic justice looks like, what that means for everyone in practice. This is not fiction, the data are there. Research has shown that presenting people with a picture of what the alternative looks like will make it much more likely for them to relate and engage. Instead of mobilizing fear and shame, we need to garner hope. Thomas Coombs, who is putting the science into practice with the hope-based communications approach, writes, we need to show people a credible vision of what a world where human rights are enjoyed by all looks like. At first, this will feel naive. But why would people join us if we do not tell them what we are for and not just against? This is what powerful movements and campaigns can and need to do. Radical thinking is all about that, imagining new worlds and possible futures and willing them into being. As Adrienne Marie Brown put it, the future is not an escapist place to occupy. All of it is the inevitable result of what we do today, and the more we take it in our hands, imagine it as a place of justice and pleasure, the more the future knows we want it and that we aren't letting go.
Nani, I'd love to start from the beginning, actually, and maybe in your own words, just tell us about the context in which you grew up, and maybe a bit about what you feel shaped the direction that you decided to go in, and really how you come to this work. So it'd be lovely to be able to sort of situate you in the world and understand your origin story.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I have to say that so I write a little bit about my context and my background in the introduction to the book. I have to confess that in the beginning, I felt a huge resistance when my editor was encouraging me to tell a bit more personal stories in there. But as I kind of like went along, kind of like thinking more about the book, I feel that it's actually quite relevant to know like who's talking to you, right? And I also think it helps. I think like underline a point I think that we all will run into about like how learning is a constant process for each and every one of us, regardless of our background and positionality. So I was born and raised in Amsterdam as the daughter to a white Dutch mother and a black Malian father. My parents got divorced when I was 6, so I was mostly raised by my mom. And consequently, because my mother never really did a lot of deep thinking and learning about anti-racism, my mom was still from the very, well, I guess in a way you could say idealistic, in another way you could say perhaps naive, belief that the racism would be solved if the world was populated with more people who look like me, basically, and that it would just disappear over time, which obviously is not the case. So I grew up looking at the world through a very wide lens, in very wide surroundings, and for me, kind of like a lot of the experiences that I had in the Netherlands that had to do with racism and so on were only really discussed at home when there were like the really blatant versions of like being called a name or someone making nasty comments to you somewhere out there in the world. And that were also the only types of conversations we would have about racism at home. So I looked at a lot of my experiences through a lens of like, okay, this is just happening to me. and I wasn't really placing it that much in a broader context. Only a bit later in life, when I started working in the NGO sector, and actually came into contact with a lot more Black women, a lot more women of color, and started exchanging experiences with each other. I started seeing that these experiences I'd been having were definitely not unique to me, but part of a pattern, and something that was happening across the board. And that kind of like, sparked a curiosity with me to learn more about it, read more about it, try to educate myself. And as life went along and work went along, work also kind of went more and more in that direction. So the personal and the professional started coming together much more, which, through some crucial kind of like pieces of work that we did with the first organization that I founded, the Digital Freedom Fund, where we initiated a decolonizing process for the digital rights field, because it very soon became very clear that the people in the room talking about the impact that technology has on our lives were not really representative of our society, and definitely not the groups who were feeling the negative impact of technology the most. Towards systemic justice, which now really focuses on making sure that marginalized groups are able to take, the power of litigation, of using the courts into their own hands. And alongside that has been a really deep process of learning, also of like what different kinds of resistance you encounter as a Black woman if you move through your career. The idea that a leadership position makes things easier for you is absolutely not true in my experience. In some cases, actually, you are exposed to even more pressure and receive less support. So all of that kind of like, I talk about that quite frankly also in the book, because I think it's important both to be honest about this learning journey that is in there. The lived experience I had, I couldn't place until I actually started learning and began a process of educating myself. But also to be really clear that, the glossy highlights reel that we see on LinkedIn from each other is only a fraction of the realities that we're living, right? And a lot of this work is just really messy, and still, we persist. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing so candidly. I resonate with a lot of what you've said. And, I'm always curious about other recovering lawyers. I mean, technically, you're still practicing. I'm no longer in practice, but I want to understand a little bit about what that was like, as a young Black woman in Europe, being in a mainstream law firm. It's very, reading the book, there were things that I didn't know and hadn't, appreciated. And I wonder if you could just share a bit about that experience and really what led you to kind of evolve out of that.
Yeah. So I trained at a big law firm in the Netherlands. This wasn't my original plan. Like when I graduated from law school, my dream was to kind of like go into human rights right away. I was dreaming of jobs at the UN and Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, those sorts of things. I did an LLM, so did a master's degree in New York at Columbia, and then stayed on for an additional year. You can extend your student visa for a year to do practical training, as they call it. And I had an internship with an NGO called Security Council Report, which reported on the UN Security Council. And in the meantime, I was just applying for jobs. I had a spreadsheet, 60 applications, like I color coded them, and like that was a red spreadsheet at some point, because no one would really hire me because I didn't have a lot of experience. I worked my way through law school, but had worked as a legal secretary and as a researcher and stuff like that, but not as a practicing lawyer. And an opportunity came up then to apply for the UN volunteers. And I asked a friend, like, should I do it? And he was like, do you feel that you can hit the ground running? And I was like, actually not so sure. And he said, like, well, you should go train at a law firm, actually properly learn how to be a proper lawyer, and then you should switch to human rights. So I followed that advice. I wasn't thrilled about it, and the law firm culture actually made it quite a tough 4 years and 2 months. I know exactly how long I was there. That says enough, I think. So it was a law firm with about 300 what they call fee earners. So those are the lawyers and the notaries and so on. So the people who bill clients for their time. So not the support staff, the secretaries and so on. And only 5 of those people were people of color. So that says something about the general diversity, quote unquote, within the law firm. And it was just, yeah, it was a really great training school for learning the trade, right? Like I really indeed learned how to be a proper lawyer, and that's the primary reason why I'm happy that I went through it. But it was also a very lonely time in the sense that yeah, it felt just very kind of like isolating to be in that environment. And I was very happy when I finalized my bar admission and could start applying for human rights job. And I escaped into the NGO world. And I thought that was going to be totally different. And it wasn't. So it was still a very wide, very still like interestingly like a male dominated scene, even though there are a lot of women working in a nonprofit world. Positions of power still to a large extent, at least at the time when I was there, were still held by men. And also in the work that we did at the organization that I moved to, Media Defense, when we worked together with other lawyers, there was just basically there was essentially a situation where an intern of ours joined a case meeting where we were planning like a really big international case and about like who was going to be leading on pleadings and so on. And where she basically was like, but wait, like this is your case. Like why are you even considering letting anyone else like open like your pleadings and so on? So the dynamic kind of like persisted there. And that really kind of like was a wake-up call for me that this was just actually a different scene, but a lot of the same dynamics. Fast forward a little bit to the Digital Freedom Fund, and they're supporting financially strategic litigation cases throughout Europe, and also trying to convene people. Kind of gave a nice overview of these dynamics in the field, and that's what really kind of like made the penny drop, if that makes sense, about this difficult dynamic within the field, and that sparked the idea for building systemic justice. But even then, I have to say that it took me about a year or so after really starting to work on that it dawned on me that we were actually the first Black-led majority Black people of color organization in Europe working on strategic litigation through an intersectional lens, that we're still a first at that point in time. It says so much about the makeup of the legal field and how accessible/inaccessible it is, depending on where you come from, and how much there still needs to change.
So tell us about systemic justice, and before that, the Digital Freedom Fund, if you would like to. But I'm really keen to debunk like what is meant by strategic litigation. Like, what is it? What is the role of strategic litigation in building the world that we need, and why is it so important to resource it?
Absolutely. So strategic litigation means using court cases to bring about bigger change. So it could be change in law, it could be change in policy, it could be change in practice. But it's really to bring about an impact that goes beyond the people who are directly involved in the case themselves. So you combine a court case with advocacy work, with campaigning, with policy work, with trying to generate public attention for an issue. And that actually also underlines like how it's part of a broader strategy for change. And it's not just about the legal argument that you're making. You could very well lose your legal argument in court, but still bring about the bigger impact that you're looking for. because the case was very important, kind of like, yeah, a part of the dominoes that you can kind of like topple over with your work. Right now, still, the people who are able to use the courts in these ways are generally people who have access to solid legal representation, who have the resources, who are able to make the time for that work, etc. And so generally, it's a tactic that's used mostly by people who are in a certain position of privilege. Whereas it's our view that people who are experiencing different forms of oppression should be able to use the courts in very much the same ways in their fight for justice. And that's what we're trying to do differently with systemic justice, and really making sure that communities are actually able to drive the processes that are about them, which is one of the things that currently is part of the kind of skewed dynamic that lawyers quite often end up leading in this work, rather than the communities who are actually experiencing the injustice and who have their own visions for what a just outcome is for them. So that's what we're trying to change.
Thank you, Nani. I've got my copy of the book here, and I was really struck by the chapter on using the master's tools, where you talk about this in your practice. And you say on page 55, losing a case can help highlight the ways in which the system is not aligning with our notions of justice, and set the community up for more impactful campaigning work towards the change they want to see. And I just wondered if you could maybe speak to how you've seen this happen in practice, because it really struck me, we know that change is, structural, systemic change is like generational, right? The struggle, the fight, and indeed it may involve like losing cases. And I just wondered whether you might be able to point to like examples from practice that would kind of really speak to how you've seen that evolve into something that's helped create transformative change in the long run.
Yeah. So there's two levels on which I can kind of like address that. One is just that there's so much work that goes into developing a litigation strategy. It really focuses the mind, right? Like, what do we prioritize? How do we prioritize it? Where does it sit in the broader constellation of our activism? And quite often, just being able to take that step to actually assert your rights in court can be something that really restores power within communities. Having that ownership, being able to use the system that people quite often have an experience of it being used against them for their own campaigns, can be super, can really strengthen the dynamic of a movement. I'm trying to not use the word empowering, because I always have a difficult relationship with that, but this is why I'm talking around it. And the other thing is that some of the examples that we've seen, I always like to think about the fight for marriage equality in the US, which was a beautiful kind of like sequencing of like smaller cases, right? So originally, back in the 70s, an attempt was made to actually petition the Supreme Court for the right to marriage equality. The Supreme Court didn't even want to entertain the issue on the merits. They were basically like, we're not even going to look at this. It's basically in better like legal language is that this is so ridiculous. We're not even going to waste our time on this. So the communities basically started to re-strategize and slowly started chipping away at the block by kind of like bringing cases on smaller thematic issues that kept on expanding gay rights. And until finally we got to the point where Obergefell became possible, right? And around that, they kept on campaigning very actively with marry-ins and all sorts of other very visible campaigning that helped kind of like sensitize the general public to the fact that, you know, the beautiful slogan that they used was "Love is love." You know, people find it hard to disagree with that generally. So it just kind of like started to resonate much more broadly, until at that point, like all the groundwork had been done, that, you know, finally there was just like one tiny last domino to tip over. So it's a nice example, because it shows like how just taking those small steps forward in combination with sustained energy around campaigning and public awareness raising can really create that momentum to kind of like finally make that big step in the end. And that is actually a campaign that took about 40 years or so, top of my head, but just not not generations, but it was actually a relatively quick win, if you like to look at it that way.
Yeah, I really I sort of felt tired in my body just hearing that, you know, hearing you talk about like sustained energy around these campaigns, and, you know, over multiple decades. And it really speaks to the staying power that is required, and how we need to support our movements, and people campaigning for change. People are on the front lines, but people who are also, you know, in you know, that may be lawyers or occupying other roles or positionalities in various struggles. In the book, you explain that systemic justice basically designs jointly strategic litigation processes in a way that sustains, heals, and removes. It that empowers communities, centering those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the case. And when I read that, I thought about like the traditional conditioning that you experience in mainstream lawyering, you know, particularly, you know, in the private sector. There are ways that we literally get programmed into behaving, and it's kind of operationalized in our like internal wiring. And I wonder what you have learned about the ways that you've had to show up differently when working with communities, and specifically, like, what are the capacities and the skills that you've had to build?
This is a great question. I mean, the conditioning starts when you're in law school, essentially, right? Like it's from the very beginning. Like as lawyers, you're kind of like told that you know, you're kind of like initiated in this unique structure where you know how to navigate the rules, how to read the laws, how to read all the social cues also that come with kind of like engaging with courts and so on. And there's also, like, I think important to them, there's an obsession with winning cases. It's always framed as like not wanting to set bad precedent, quote unquote, conveniently forgetting that a lot of these really big victories that we all are so excited about build on a number of losses like along the way, right? So there's something there about not acknowledging how those can actually be stepping stones. There's that, and then there's just like the idea that because we know how it works, we're probably the best ones to make decisions or advise our clients on like which direction to take, depending on what their options are. And what the community-driven model that we work with requires is basically letting go of all of that and letting go of all the ego that's kind of instilled in the profession that you've been trained in, and basically say like this all needs to start with and be decided by the community themselves from the beginning. So we start the conversation in a very different way from the usual. Oh, what is your problem? Okay, I can see these legal options. These are the things that you can choose from. Just give me an assignment and I'll run off and write a brief and I'll let you know how it goes. Instead of that, we actually start with, we were just talking about the dreaming and like, what could it look like? But this question, like, what would it look like if things work for your community in the ways that you wanted them to work? What is the blue sky vision? What is the goal that you're working towards? What are the things that you're already doing? Are you already campaigning? Are you doing advocacy, et cetera, et cetera? What is your capacity to kind of engage in other things? What is your risk for appetite? Your appetite for risk when you think about taking a case to court? And looking at all of those things, we start mapping, like, what does the landscape look like? Who are your allies? Who are your possible opponents? And putting all those ingredients together, we start looking at what the different options are. And then we talk them through in detail, including like what the support might be that the community partner might need. Is there a risk of re-traumatizing anyone? What can we do to mitigate for that, etc. And then a litigation strategy is decided upon by the community partner. So the lawyers, in the case, that would be us, and sometimes outside legal counsel, play much more a facilitating role than a leading role, which is very different from the way also that I used to litigate, right, in the past when I was engaged in that work myself with an NGO. And definitely from what I did at the law firm. So there's a lot there in kind of like decentering yourself and really also resisting the pull that you get, because a lot of people are very used to working with lawyers in a certain dynamic, in kind of the traditional way. So would be tempted to kind of like say, but what would you decide? And you really have to make sure that you actually get to a place where all those questions that they have and the questions and the hesitation and so on, that they have all the information that they need in order to make an informed decision themselves. And then we're there to help make it happen in real time.
And I mean, I wonder like how you've had to organize yourself structurally, or like your practices structurally at Systemic Justice, in order to show up in that kind of way. Like you've had to orientate yourself differently. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking about some of the groups that you've worked with and the different needs that there have been, and maybe whether you could speak to an example that you're able to share, even if you don't have to disclose the identity, but if you're able to just share the kinds of groups you've been working with and how you've had to move differently with some of them.
Yeah, I think so. We started the work by trying to define also what we should be focusing on by asking communities themselves, right? Like, so if you look at the list of issues in Europe that have to do with racial, social, and economic justice, you have a really long list. Everything is urgent, but we had to prioritize because we also knew that we couldn't do everything at once as a small organization that was just getting started. So we went through a really elaborate process of actually talking to everyone, listening and trying to make sense of that, reflecting back what we were seeing. We also did a really thorough mapping of the legal landscape, what was already happening, and then ended up with climate justice and social protection as focus areas, because those were both really high on the agenda for the community partners and underserved by litigation that took an intersectional approach. And that listening approach has basically been like the fundamental groundwork for all the partnerships that we have been building over the past years. Some of the things that sound maybe really silly is just really kind of figuring out how does the community partner organize, right? Like when do they talk to each other? How do they talk to each other? What day of the week, what time of day is good to meet, and so on. So it's not the assumption already showing up without the assumption that everyone just kind of like clocks in at a certain time in the morning and clocks off at the end of the day, but that a lot of groups are doing this work like outside of their regular jobs. So, you will have to meet up in the evening or on a Saturday or hold a workshop on the weekend and things like that. So there's a lot there about just asking and making sure that you share that information, really understand how they work, if they are resourced, to what extent there are support structures or not, in order to be able to actually make it as low threshold as possible to engage in the process. And that can range from all sorts of different things, such as indeed like having the workshop on a Saturday, because that's the day when most people can actually make the time. Making sure that there's food in the evening so people can kind of like meet around a meal, to actually figuring out where people can meet, because we've also spoken to partners where part of the problems that they were facing was actually that the community spaces were being taken away in their neighborhoods. So there actually was no physical space for them to gather. So yeah, it could be any of those things and more.
Thank you. I always think that your work is so audacious, and I love the way that you learn out loud, and you're very generous to the field, to the broader ecosystem, sharing about your work, your practice, the way that you run the organization. And I was struck again by, I think it's actually in the introduction where it's kind of like a cautionary note on perfectionism, right? And if I may just read um, this paragraph where you say, each of us can make what American civil rights activist John Lewis called good trouble in different ways. And please don't wait until you think you found the perfect way to do so. Perfectionism is one of the ways white supremacy culture manifests itself and blocks the path towards liberation. Yes, you need to be careful not to harm anyone with your actions, but if, as Healing Justice London founder Fazana Khan says, it is safe enough to try, good enough for now, you should go for it. We need a tapestry of activism to make change. The important thing is that we keep on making our way towards a more just world. And that really sat with me because it's something that's always very live in my own practice and in our collective practice as an organization at the Good Ancestor movement. When you're trying to do bold, sometimes experimental things towards transformative change, it can be terrifying because, you can often find yourself worried about making mistakes, right? And causing harm.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways I think you even do embody this in the book is the decision that you made to do a note on language, a specific note on the language. Actually, before I go on, why did you put that in?
I put that in because it's something that I just I'm very actively thinking about that every day, like how we name things. What does it mean? What does it reflect? What are the power structures that are actually so deeply ingrained in the words that we choose to use for certain things? It's and I wanted to be really upfront about that was why I use the word like racialized and marginalized, because it's constructs, it's things that we are doing to certain people. Those are not neutral facts. And I think it's really important to try and reflect it as much as possible when we talk about things. And I want to make clear that that was one of the things that I try to actively do in the book, but also that I, of course, reference other people's texts, other people's words, and that there also are imperfect terms that I actually don't really have a good alternative for yet, I will say, at the moment. Like there's, of course, that there's a starting point, right? That you would want to identify everyone as they want to be identified, but then how do you do that with larger groups of people in a way that doesn't center whiteness with another acronym than BIPOC? Like I'm still struggling. I know there's alternatives. I'm still not entirely happy with with any of them so far, but we should keep on trying. But I just thought it was important to flag that also because I think that part of that is also maybe the hope that it might trigger this deeper thinking with people who read that about like, so what are the narratives that we're actually being fed, and a lot of that happens very very subtly in word choice actually, and it helps lock in power dynamics, and yeah, we should push back against that, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I also really appreciated throughout the book your rigorous commitment to good citation in line with Black feminist principles, and also the fact that you say inevitably will also have made mistakes, right? And I'm still learning, like every one of us. I think you model that really beautifully in a way that is, it's within the parameters of language, but language, as we know, is very powerful. and can, either move us towards the world that we're trying to build or away from it. So I was talking about perfectionism and how this is something that is very live for me and other colleagues across the field, and particularly those of us who are working to liberate resources. So, mainly money, but land, other resources. What do you think are some of the traps that people and organizations moving money might fall into when they're trying to do something
Yeah.
different? They're trying to
Mhm.
resource something different in a different way, you know, and then it's like yeah, I'm curious about what you feel the traps are.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is that there somehow is this idea that you should be able to predict what is going to be the thing that is going to make the change happen. And we can't tell, right? Like we don't know. Besides the fact that it's just impossible to kind of like pinpoint one particular intervention that will have brought about whatever big change you think about. It might have been the thing that pushed over the final domino, but it's not all the things that needed to happen in order for that to be possible in the first place, right? So this tapestry of activism that I speak about is just really like there are so many different things that need to happen at the same time, in sequence, etc. And you will never know which of these things is going to, in the end, look like it's the thing that made it all happen. But all of these other bits are also important. And I feel, especially in this time of where we all just feel the urgency, right, of the way, the direction in which things are moving at such like rapid speed. It would be really nice to get rid of that hesitation, to just kind of like try to just support a whole bunch of different things and just see what happens. There's almost something there about like trusting the process within the ecosystem rather than trying to game it. Because if we had figured that out, um, we wouldn't be in this place where we are now to begin with. And then there would be some sort of formula that you could you could apply to like how you do investments, and how you resource what kind of work. You don't know. What you often see is that something is seen as the final domino pusher, and then everyone rushes to kind of resource more of that. Whereas like that is exactly the kind of work that could have been supported earlier had people not been so narrow in their perceptions of what's going to bring about change.
Yeah, I'm really hearing the what you've just spoken to, the tapestry of activism, and not knowing, like, will there be some things we will do that we'll never actually know, and there's an element of like surrender and you know surrender of control, or like a perception of control.
And really kind of like the trust element, right? Because who is going to know better than the people
Mm.
who are contending with the oppression on a day-to-day basis? So there's also something there about indeed about letting go, but also kind of saying like, okay, I trust you to make these calls. So you tell me what you need, and here it is. Rather than saying, we think this is the solution, so come with a plan that matches that, even though the people themselves might actually feel that a very different intervention is much more useful at that point in time. And also the kind of like only betting on a certain type of intervention also locks people in, right? They're not able to pivot in the moment when something else is needed because they're tied into some project or whatnot. It's not how the world works. So you should give people that flexibility.
Yeah, I hear that around the flexibility, and I'm also hearing the piece around like trust, and who's trusted and who's more likely to be trusted, who's not, and how do we move from, certainly something that I'm really hungry to see in the resourcing or resource mobilization ecosystem is like how we begin to build more solidarity with one another, even
Mm-hmm.
if we don't agree on everything, or frankly, whether or not we get on personally, like we there's some work to do, and we can we can make that choice to enact solidarity with each other.
Would agree. Yeah.
So linked to perfectionism is something that I've been training, I've been getting my reps in holding contradictions that inevitably arise when doing social justice work and transformative change work.
Mm.
So, we want to move at the speed of trust with communities or other folks we're in relationship with that we need to be building like powerful coalitions with. And the landscape is like rapidly changing, like every day we're seeing shifts. And I'm noticing and have been noticing over the past year also that my capacity to hold discomfort and to maybe tolerate decisions that don't feel ideal, but for the sake of like building something, right? And like moving when we need to move, instead of waiting until we feel like we've got absolutely everything right, whatever right
Mm-hmm.
is, our idea of right. Yeah, that discomfort and like how do we build our capacity to tolerate building something that feels imperfect, that doesn't, that isn't how we would want it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about how those contradictions arise for you in your own work, and what strategies or capacities have you sort of worked on in order to be able to keep building, because that's one thing you
Mm-hmm.
absolutely have done many times over, is your ability to build is phenomenal.
This is an excellent question. So I think one of the leading, well, there's two things that are leading. One is like the thing that you mentioned before about harm, about being mindful that you don't cause harm with your initiative. So that I think is like a really important analysis to have up front. But then I think about the other bits. There's Well, first of all, I'm just like I don't believe that there ever will be a perfect plan for any of the things that we want to try. Um, I just feel that in certain situations it gets dressed up better and it gets presented in a more glossy way, but like nothing is foolproof, right? So the only way of figuring out if it can actually make a difference is by trying it. And I think that by acknowledging upfront that you don't quite know how it might turn out, and that you're going to keep a very close eye on how things unfold, and that you're willing to adapt if you see that things aren't going in a direction that's productive. Then I don't quite see the problem of not getting going with it. And I think a lot of it is about feeling comfortable and being open about like why you need to adapt, or why you think, what your analysis as to like why something isn't working, what you might be changing, or why you decide to then actually take a completely different route. But I think there's something there about like taking that your ego out of the equation there as a human being, right? Like I said earlier, like it's all a lot messier than we sometimes like to think, and messy can lead to really beautiful things, and sometimes it's just messy and it didn't go anywhere, and that's really valuable information to learn from and to figure out what to try next. I this kind of like adopting an attitude of continuously learning and kind of like taking the information of what isn't working forward, still doesn't get you to perfection, but at least it kind of like gives you good pointers on where to try next, right? And I don't know, I guess I just, for myself, at some point kind of like came to a point where it's like, well, all I can do is try. We can all just try. And with some luck, some of us will have good outcomes with that. And And in that sense, also, it's like also about what you were saying earlier about solidarity. It's also like being supportive of other people's efforts. Like they're not yours. They might not have been your choice. They might not have been the way that you've gone about it. But like we don't know. We don't know what's going to be successful in the end. So
Yeah, thank you, Nani. I want to talk about collective liberation because it's a phrase that we use a lot, in our work. And I think sometimes it can begin to lose its meaning unless we constantly remind ourselves, like, what are we talking about? Like, and you speak to the imagination and the world building that, sometimes it feels like we don't have time to do. And I think it's really important that we remind ourselves, for the sake of what are we doing this work collectively?
mhm.
But I think it can feel sometimes intangible to like imagine literally what would it look like for all of us to be free? Like what? So I'm wondering, what does liberation look like and feel like to you?
Oh, this is such a good question, and I'm really glad that you brought up like how difficult it is to kind of do this exercise. Um, we did it at some point with the team retreat where we just kind of like took a system and just tried to imagine what it would look like had colonialism and so on never happened. Like, and what a different world that was. And it's difficult to get there from like all the things you see around you now. Um, well, what does liberation look like to me? Like I think I point to it in the final chapter where I referenced the Combahee River Collective, who say that if Black women were free, that would mean that all of us would be free, because that means we would have done away with all systems of oppression. And for me, that holds true. Their whole statement is amazingly timeless. Um, but I really think that unless we kind of get to the root causes of oppression, which are like fundamentally rooted in anti-Black discrimination, um, none of us, none of us will be free. And I think that when I imagine moving through the world in a world where that would have been dealt with, I imagine a lot of levity. I imagine a lot of joy. Um, I imagine an absence of fear, and like the kind of like, it's something I've only become kind of like aware of, like I think like last year or so, that there's always this kind of like there's this constant under hum somewhere of threat, and you don't know where it might come from, that you experience living in this world as a Black woman, and that is just background noise that you no longer kind of like acknowledge, but it's always there, like the science is there about like what weathering does to all of us, but yeah, that's what I would imagine. Like, yeah, more joy, more levity, freedom.
Thank you, Nani. We're going to move towards like some questions and maybe some more conversation shortly, but I feel like it's really important to acknowledge the moment that we're in,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, being situated in Europe currently and seeing the shift towards the far right and the ways in which that is affecting our communities. And I'm thinking about like what you're seeing and what are some of the things that you think, as a community of, we're a community of people organizing wealth holders and people with access to significant resources that can transform the world, or at least play a part in doing that. And I'm wondering, what are some things that we should be paying attention to in your view, and yeah, what are some opportunities for us?
Um, so I love this question. I think that what for me is really important to have very clear is that what we're seeing right now is the reality that so many people have lived for such a long period of time. It is only becoming more visible to those of us who were able to shield ourselves from it now because things have gotten particularly dire. But all of these things have been there already. They're not new. You can use beautiful, lofty frames about how it's colonialism turned inwards and all of those things. But just the fact of the matter is that this oppression has been around for a long time. Just a really big number of people were unable to not see it. And I'm saying that as an active thing, right? They were able to not see it. So that also means that had the people who were at the front line of this oppression been able to resist with more resources and more power earlier on, we would be in a different place right now. And I think that that is the cue that we should take for what this moment requires. It requires swift, trust-based, generous resourcing of the people who already know this oppression and who know what to do with it, so that they are able to fight back at full strength. Because it's only they're like I always struggle a bit with front line because we're giving all the war analogies and so on, and I'm also using all the fighting language and so on. But they are the ones who have been experienced this for a long time, who know what to do, and who also know what the remedies are. So they are the ones who should be driving the pushback against it as well. So I feel that if any urgency is felt right now, it should be really to kind of make sure that they are enabled to the maximum degree possible to actually do that work. And I'm not part of a lot of the conversations in wealth holders spaces. I am part of some of the conversations within the philanthropy, kind of like foundations and so on. And I get, to be quite frank, really frustrated about the endless conversation about what needs to happen. And then I'm talking to foundations that sit on giant endowments. That money is going to outlast the existence of the planet if it doesn't get spent now, while it's still worth something, while people can still translate it into actual action in turning the course of things around. And to me, it's a no-brainer, and I just don't understand why we're still talking and not doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Shall we move into some questions, Nani?
Sure, yes.
Yeah.
The Q&A.
Yeah.
Let's see. All right. So I'll just start at the top.
Sure.
So I'm going to read them out just in case. So the populist movements sweeping across the globe often use simplistic yet highly emotional language that any primary school student can understand. Their messages are easy to understand, but toxic to justice-based ideas. However, the language on the left uses lofty language to try to bring people into a more inclusive world, but not everyone can access that language. How do we make more progressive ideals more accessible to the majority of people who probably agree with progressive ideals, but don't feel comfortable in the parlance? This is a really great question, and that's actually, to a large extent, what the hope-based communications method really looks at. It's really about the showing of the alternative. Because the research that I was referring to in the bit that I wrote, that I read out earlier, really shows that people actually also, like, besides like word choice, are really much less able to relate to against language than actually the kind of like the subsequently showing of a better of an alternative version, so something that they can actually relate to and see in their mind's eye. I sometimes joke that we on the left just need better branding and better marketing in order to be able to kind of come up with better wording to kind of like make the really wonderful things that we're fighting for sound just like more appealing, right? It's so yes, I think it's practice. right? I think that there's a lot of unlearning to be done. I'm just really simplistically using left and right language. But I think that on the left, there is a tendency to want to be really purist and be really precise about like how we describe systems of oppression and how we describe power structures, etc., which is important to a certain degree. And then we also need to be able to translate it for others. So one of the exercises that I used to do when I was working on digital rights, when I was speaking about these things in a public setting, I was trying to kind of like imagine explaining this to my mom, who really kind of like had an aversion to technology. She only had a computer when I was living abroad, and literally threw it on the street the moment that I returned to the Netherlands, because she didn't want to engage with the machine anymore. But like I was just trying to like think like, okay, how would I be able to explain this to her? And so it's practice. It's a discipline that we need to build. And it's quite possible to talk about complex things in accessible language without dumbing them down or doing them a disservice. So yeah, I think it's just work that we really need to do.
Yeah, and I was trying to find the section of the book where you quote someone who says it's their job to make the revolution irresistible.
Yes,
You
Tony K.
know,
Bombara. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, like it's got it.
Yeah.
There's something about, there is like a
Yeah.
nugget in what you say about marketing, that it's got to feel really irresistible. And there's this influencer called Jimmy the Giant who used to be on the far right and is now on the left. And he says that he misses the how embraced he was and how kind everyone was to him, whereas on the left, it's a miserable place, for him, in his words. So there is definitely some work to do. Antonio and
Um,
Christie say, make it sexy and make it punk.
I like that
Nice.
one. It's a good. We should get T-shirts with
A
that on it.
t-shirt. Yeah,
Actually, I think.
exactly.
Are there any recent changes or movements that have made me feel more hopeful? So, at the risk of sounding really tried, like whenever we talk to whoever of our community partners, I feel hopeful because they're I just always just feel really, really honored that we get to work with them and that we get to support their cause in some small way because of um, they're always kind of in the middle of firefighting on all sorts of different fronts, right? It's like it's quite often not just the cause that we're working on together. It's all sorts of other challenges around that as well, right? In their living situation, in schools and work and whatnot, and they still are so focused on kind of like um, engaging in the cause that they're fighting for. And I just find that, yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to not kind of get to all the annoying, like inspiring and like whatever kind of phrasings and so on. But it's just really impressive. I think it's really impressive. And um, yeah, it really does make me hopeful that if people are able to sustain like that amount of energy and fire to kind of like to keep on pushing for change, yeah, that is actually irresistible to not want to go along with that. So um, I very much look forward to reading your book. Thank you. Are there any practical actions you hope readers take after reading the book, even if they are not in justice work at the moment? Thank you for that question. So what I try to do in the book, actually at the end of each chapter, is have there's a what you can do next section. So the chapters all try to explain the root causes of the oppression, the system of oppression that we're seeing in the world today. It gives a lot of examples how people are resisting in different places across the world. But it also tries to lower the threshold to actually do something with all of that, rather than just sit and be feel paralyzed by the fact that everything is intertwined and it's all very big. So the what you can do next section gives things that you could use to learn a little bit more. If the topic interests you, what are other things you could read or listen to? to do a deeper dive. Then there's a set of reflection questions that kind of like helps the reader to tie the bigger systemic issues that are addressed in the chapter to their individual context. And then there's a take action section that kind of gives starting points for figuring out where you could take action. Recurring thread actually throughout the book is that the idea that each of us has a own sphere of influence in the many different contexts in which we operate. That sphere of influence is different, right? There might be contexts in which you have a lot of power. There are ones where you're just one of the many that doesn't have necessarily a lot of weight to pull there. But we do have a degree of power in whichever context we operate. So the idea is to really figure out in each of those contexts, like what is my entry point for bringing about change for good here. And to really kind of like build that reflex of always being mindful of that, like what can I actually do here? So it's applicable in all sorts of contexts, not just in justice work. Thank you for that question. Acknowledging that we all have different roles to play in making change, how can we build the capacity to be able to prioritize collaboration, understanding what others are doing, and being able to see our work within a bigger picture? It always feels hard to make space for that, especially when there's a perceived urgency in our own area of work. Yes, I agree. I agree with that. And I actually don't quite know like what the prescription is for that. I feel that a lot of this is again like it's about practice, and it's about it's about allowing ourselves the space to at least kind of like ask the question as to whether or not the urgency is a valid one, or is it if it's one that we are kind of like fueling ourselves, if that makes sense. A lot of it has to unfortunately kind of like do with personal discipline, but I think there are also things that you can build in within an organizational context, right? Like when you're collaborating with others, about just being in a practice to kind of say like, okay, let's just take a minute or 2 minutes to just kind of like sit with this, and then ask ourselves a couple of questions to kind of really make sure that we rate this in the right kind of way. Like, should we all drop everything else that we're doing to respond to this, or is this something that we can deal with in a different way? Because there's this tension, right, between always responding to what's in the moment and not leaving any capacity to deal with the ground causes that need to be challenged in order for all of those things to not keep on coming your way. So those are things to be really mindful of in deciding what to spend energy on. It's not easy, so I'm absolutely not suggesting that it's an easy practice to build, but I do think it's essential for the longer term view that you also need to have, right? Because we're like putting out one fire at a time. That is important, but at the same time, that deeper work also needs to happen in order to make sure that that won't be necessary anymore. Should I scroll on?
Yeah.
You mentioned the human ego, and I wondered if you could talk to what self-work you believe is supportive for people to work with that, to enable them to move more freely through the difficulties of the work itself and the ecosystem. That's a really great question, and such an appropriate question to ask in a conversation with the Good Ancestor movement, because that is like for me at least, that is the way that I like to put my own contribution into proper perspective, knowing that whatever I'm hopefully able to contribute during my lifetime builds on the work that others have done before me, and that others will be there to take over when I'm no longer able to do my bit. And I think that this kind of like zooming out and placing yourself in context, not only just like in your current context, how you're standing shoulder to shoulder, but lots of other people trying to do their bit to make change, but also over a longer timeline, is really helpful in looking at yourself in perspective, not to minimize like your contribution or to not kind of like acknowledge that, but also to look at it in the perspective of like you can try things and fail, and it's still going to be it's still going to keep on moving in the right direction, right? You're not going to single-handedly ruin everything for everyone if one of the plans that you made doesn't work out the way that you thought. So yeah, just zooming out, I think, is what works for me anyway. Great, the questions are really coming now. So looking forward to reading this. As a white woman in her 20s, I've done a lot of work on decentering myself and giving minoritized groups my resources and using my privilege to give them more power and space. Many initiatives and protests take place in Dublin. How can I start a movement outside of the capital city? I want to give my students the power, but I have acknowledged, and they have acknowledged, that it is safer for me to do it and not place the emotional burden on minorities. How do I do this without causing harm? This is not a silly question. In response to the bit that's between brackets, indicating that you're very early in your journey and committed to lifelong learning. How can I mobilize people in a safe way after consulting with my students? And how do I make it irresistible, sexy, and funky? Well, that's a lot of questions in one. I'm not sure I'm able to answer this in full, like without knowing the exact context. Even though, thank you for the information that you shared. And I really love the focus on actually doing things outside the capital, which is thing that we too often seem to forget. I was coincidentally, no apologies at all. I was coincidentally rereading a bit of Frans Fanon earlier today, and was exactly about this, about like, you know, change happening only in the capital and there being a disconnect with what's happening elsewhere in the country. I like my kind of like kind of like standard advice always is ask the people who should be leading this, right? Like what would they like to see? I understand the safety question, but I think that there's a huge difference between like who's visible on the outside and what the exact plans are, if that makes sense. So there's something there about having a lot of really good conversations and asking all the questions, including all the questions about all the ways in which people would not want to be supported, because we quite often have a tendency, right, to kind of like come with a beautiful plan that sounds nice, but then we also need to ask about all the ways in which we could do it wrong. So I think that would be a really good place to start, like, where outside the capital city, what should it look like? What would be helpful to actually get people in motion? What is needed on a very practical level to actually get people together, to get people organized, and kind of like take it from there? Yeah, that would be my suggestion. And I think that the question of what is irresistible, sexy, and punk is also a question to ask for your what is it, guys? What do you say, Mark? Your target group. What would they find? What would they think qualifies as such? I really want this T-shirt now.
Yeah,
yeah.
I love the theme. There is one more question in the chat this time,
Okay.
from Antonia and Christy again. Beginning, Christy works at a very progressive school.
Okay. Christy works at a very progressive school that is committed to the DEI principles. Are there any new books that you would recommend to school-age children to help them understand the ideas that you are passionate about? James by Percival Everett, for example. So school-age, James is a pretty grown-up book, I think, but gosh. Oh my gosh. Like my brain is now going all over the place. So I would love to give this a little bit more thought. But what I would say as a shortcut to having someone much more expert than I am when it comes to, especially for children and young adults, um, I think her name is Claire Linney. You'll find her on Instagram. She has an amazing account in which she highlights all sorts of, well, she kind of like made an alternative to this, was it the Guardian list, I think recently with the 100 whatever books. She kind of made an alternative for that with like children's books because she thought she didn't like the list very much. And her account is like full of really great recommendations, sometimes based on themes, sometimes based on age group, sometimes about like, giving a different perspective on history and so on. Like really look her up. She's really great.
Awesome. Well, before we sort of move towards handing over to Nikki again, I think that's all the questions. One thing in closing that I'm really keen to ask you, Nani, is like, who is Nani beyond the revolution, right? Like when when we don't have to fight anymore and struggle and, you know, have all these tactics and strategies, like what will you be doing on the other side of the revolution?
Oh, I'll be writing lots of fiction actually. I'll be writing lots of fiction. I'll be taking walks with my dogs, going for swims at the beach, and I'll be doing a lot more cooking. I think it's one of those things that I can't like relax by cooking. I need to be relaxed in order to cook. Otherwise, it stresses me out as another chore. Um, I think those things. Yeah, yeah, going to the opera a lot. I don't know, those sorts of things. But definitely, yeah. After of course, like this book and the next book I'll write have solved all the problems in the world, I'll be writing fiction.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us, Nani. It's been a real honor. It's been a joy as well.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great.
Yeah, get the book, everybody. Radical Justice. Independent bookshops, of course.
Obviously, yes.
Nikki, I think we're going to hand back over to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for for everything, both of you. It was a really wonderful discussion and yeah, really amazing to bring in some joy and dreaming about a sexy punk movement that we need to build. And yeah, also very excited to read your fiction, Nani, when it arises, when that moment comes. I'm sure it will be brilliant. Um, yeah, it's been wonderful, and thank you everyone for your really wide-ranging and interesting questions as well. Yeah, really appreciate your engagement and yeah, all of the interesting questions that you've brought. So thank you everyone for being with us. It's been a really wonderful time together. We're just going to finish by posting a couple of links in the chat. One of them is Nani's book is accompanied by a website and a page that lists some relevant and aligned organizations that people can support financially or otherwise. So please check that out and share it with people who might be in a position to support. And then the other one is our Good Ancestor Movement Ticket Tailor box office, where we'll be sharing our events as they come up throughout the year. The next one is going to be in July, and it's going to be a conversation with Susanna Penfield, who's a wealth holder organizer. It's going to be themed around the intergenerational dynamics of wealth stewardship and how we can collaborate across generations for radical redistribution. And Susanna will be coming along with her mum, and they'll be talking about their kind of journey together of kind of busting their trust fund and redistributing wealth. So that should be a really exciting and a bit more of an interactive session as well. So yeah, hopefully we'll see some of you again. And um, it's been wonderful. So thanks to everyone. and we'll leave you to get on with the rest of your evenings and enjoy the last bits of sun if you have any. Thanks so much. Bye.